Welcome to Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Weldin. Today's story is called Different Boats, an original story suggested by The Saying, co-written for you by Daniel Hinds and myself. Thanks. Enjoy the episode. Different Boats. Once upon a time, a terrible storm swept down upon a peaceful little ocean town. It came out of nowhere, sudden as a stroke of lightning. Lots of people were caught out in their boats, tossed about by the waves that went from little swells to towering walls of frothing water. The sun was suddenly blotted out by clouds all dark and boiling. The thunder was so loud it split the world, and the wind was a banshee's cry, stripping the shouts from people's frightened mouths. "Everything secure?" a fishing captain named Ricky bellowed out to his fishing sloop. "Aye, aye, sir," bellowed back his crew. There were others in boats all around Ricky and his crew. A couple boats were medium like theirs, but most boats were much smaller. There were even a bunch of tiny dinghies, only big enough to hold 2 or 3 people out on the water. They were tossed and twisted and turned all the same, the salty sea spray stinging at their faces and drumming their decks. Their passengers clung to their boats and to each other, trying desperately to weather the sudden squall. "Are you okay down there?" Ricky called out to the tiny boats below. "We're hanging in there," one of the passengers called up at him. "We'll get through this together. We've done it before." Ricky started to reply, but a huge wave hit the side of his boat and he almost went tumbling on the deck. The boats down below got the full force of the wave and they started taking on water. The passengers got to work, bailing seawater out of their tiny vessels as fast as possible. Just then, a huge horn sounded in the distance. A bigger boat, one of the few massive yachts out on the sea, came cutting through the waves. The storm raged around it, but the bigger boat was holding steady, rocking back and forth only a little, thanks to its giant bulk. "Look, help is on the way!" Ricky called out to the tiny boats below while his crew began waving their hands and shouting to get the huge yacht's attention. The passengers on the boat below looked to be trying to say something, but Ricky couldn't hear it over the wind. "Captain!" Ricky's first mate called to him and signaled that the yacht had slowed. It was massive and white, with big letters on the side spelling out the name of the ship, Serenity. A tiny man was barely visible on the prow. "Ahoy there!" he called into a megaphone. "What a surprising storm we're having!" Ricky chuckled a little, taken aback by the man's carefree tone. "Surprising indeed!" Ricky shouted back, hoping that he could be heard over the shrieking winds. "How are you faring? I couldn't help but notice that your yacht is huge. Some of us in smaller boats are struggling to stay afloat. Could you take some people aboard, just until the storm passes?" Ricky did not think this was a big ask. The yacht looked to have enough room to take on all the passengers in the dinghies, plus Ricky's entire crew, maybe 3 or 4 times over. "Take some people aboard?" the yacht captain repeated incredulously. "Surely they can't be struggling that badly. I mean, I'm out here in the same storm, and it doesn't really seem that bad to me." "Well, sure," Ricky said, as patiently as possible. "But you're on a massive yacht, so it doesn't feel the same to you. We're in the same storm, but on very different boats." Interesting," said the captain from the high and mighty deck. "I'd never considered it before, but I suppose it might be more challenging to weather a storm from a tiny boat. Well, be sure to send them my thoughts and prayers. I need to go take in the deck chairs so they don't get wet." "They need more than your thoughts and prayers," Ricky yelled up at the massive yacht. "Please help." "What's that?" the yacht captain called back, walking away. "I can't hear you over the sound of me moving these deck chairs." "Unbelievable!" Ricky started to say, but the wind howled again, and he had to duck down and cling to the rigging of his sail. The storm grew more violent. The wind bellowed like a giant with a toothache, and the rain came in sideways like a fire hose. Ricky watched in horror as the smaller boats below rocked and rolled in the waves before capsizing and spilling their passengers into the water. "All hands on deck! Let's get these people!" he shouted out, and he and the crew began the task of pulling people out of the water. They got them all, one by one, soaking wet and teeth chattering with cold, but safe and sound all the same. When they were all boarded, Ricky's sloop was absolutely filled to the brim. The Serenity was still visible and definitely could have fit everyone comfortably, but Ricky noticed that it had pulled up its ladders and folded its sails. "We tried to tell you it was no use asking," one of the dinghy passengers called over to Ricky. "That was Wally Bucksworth, Jr." There were some indignant snorts from some of the other dripping wet people they'd pulled from the water. "Wally Bucksworth, Jr.? Like Bucksworth Manufacturing?" "That's the one! His daddy owns the whole thing, and then he oversees day-to-day operations at the shipbuilding factory. We all work there. He wasn't gonna help us out." "But if he oversees the day-to-day, doesn't he know all of you? Why wouldn't he let you aboard?" "Well, he oversees a manager that oversees a manager that oversees a manager. You know, he's never met any of us personally. We're just numbers to him, basically. Only cares if we don't make quota. I don't even think he knows my name, and I've worked for him for 15 years. "Oh, well, that's awful." "That's the way it is." "Should we head toward land, Captain?" a crew member asked. They looked to shore, but it was so far away it was nothing more than a brown-green smudge on the horizon. The clouds went darker still, and day turned to night, the sun a distant memory behind the angry, raging storm. Waves thrashed against the sides of the overstuffed sloop, and the ship began to groan and shudder. The wood was pushed by the wind and pulled by the sea, twisting horribly in different directions. Boards began to burst underneath them, and dark, churning water flooded in around their feet. The already soaked passengers and the newly damp crew members began working wildly to bail out the ship. Another massive yacht was approaching on the port side. For a moment, Ricky thought it was the same useless ship from before, but this one, he realized, was emblazoned with a different name: Destiny. "Excuse me!" Ricky called up at the captain of the yacht, barely more than a blob on the ship's deck. "Excuse me, we're really struggling down here and my boat is taking on water. I couldn't help but notice that you have an enormous yacht that we could all comfortably fit on. Permission for myself and my crew to come aboard?" "Oh, no. A lady's voice came through a megaphone, cutting through the wind and the rain and ringing in Ricky's ears. "Now is not a good time. We're just about to have dinner and we haven't planned for guests." Ricky felt a swell of anger in his chest, but he tried his best to keep his cool. "We are literally about to get swept away in the storm unless you allow us to come aboard." "Pardon? Oh, I can't hear you over the sound of the wind. There's a storm going, you know." Ricky raged. "I know! My boat is breaking in the storm and we need help! Permission to come aboard!" "Oh, permission denied. You should have known there could be storms like this and bought a better boat, like I did." "Don't you think we would have if we could? We all bought the best boats we could afford." "Still, you don't need a handout. You need to learn a lesson. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps." "I'd love to," called one of the dinghy passengers. "But an octopus ate 'em already. No boots left." And he wiggled his pruny toes to show her. The woman looked disgusted at the display, and the yacht sailed away, swamping them in its wake. "The nerve!" Ricky cried out in frustration, but as he looked over at the passengers from the dinghy, he saw that they were chuckling bitterly. "What's so funny?" Ricky asked. Well, a lady said, using her cupped hands to throw seawater over her shoulder and off the side of the boat. That was Alice Bucksworth, Wally's sister and Walter's daughter. She does the books for Bucksworth Manufacturing. It's just funny that you thought she would care enough to help us when we already know she doesn't, because if she did, she would pay us more than dinghy money in the first place.
Plus, she was born rich, chimed in the barefoot soldier. She never had to pull herself up by her bootstraps a day in her life.
Nope, just satin slippers for her from day one. Just then, they spied a wave, bigger than all the rest, rushing towards them. Ricky's sloop fell into its shadow, the wave towering above like a deadly avalanche about to fall. The water roared, the wind howled, the sky went full black. No sun, no stars. It was a nightmare of shrieking salt and storm, and then it came down, down, down like a hammer from the heavens. Everybody hold on! The waves smashed into them, pushing salt water into their eyes and ears and nose and deep into their mouths. For a moment, the world was nothing but tumbling limbs and broken wood and whipping waves. The sloop was smashed to splinters and sent the sailors soaring. Ricky and the others clawed against the wild sea and bobbed back up in their life vests, like tub toys swirling around the drain. Everyone okay? Ricky shouted, and the others chorused back. All fine!
Okay. Awesome over here.
Ricky surveyed the scene. People were clinging to pieces of wreckage and getting tossed by the raging seas. The situation was growing more dire by the minute. If they all stayed in the water too long, well, Ricky didn't want to think about that. Another yacht was growing closer, blown by the blustering breeze. After the last two, Ricky didn't imagine they'd be much help, but there weren't a lot of options. This one was also large and white, and the name on the side read, Carpe Diem. This must be Walter Bucksworth Sr., Ricky thought to himself. We need help! He called up to the yacht deck as loudly as he could. Our boats have all capsized and we're in real danger. Permission to come aboard before someone drowns. An old man in a fine suit came to the railing. He looked down at the crowd floating in the stormy sea and shook his head.
Oh dear, what a mess you've gotten yourself into. I can't let you come aboard now, though, you understand. We've just had the carpets redone and you'd get them all wet. My sympathies, though. Let me see what I have that could help.
He disappeared from the railing and returned a few minutes later.
This should do the trick,
the yacht captain said magnanimously, and he tossed down a single life ring. Ricky looked around him at the dozens of people in the water, struggling to stay afloat. 1 life ring? He called up. What do you think all of us are going to do with 1 life ring?
Well, I'm sure you'll make do. We're all in the same storm, you know. We all have to be resourceful.
We're in the same storm, but you're in a bigger boat, Ricky cried out, totally at his wit's end. Fine, you don't have to let us up, but we're coming aboard anyway. Ricky signaled to the others, and they sprang into action. Someone found some ropes ripped free of a sail. Another found a metal hook used to secure cargo floating on a plank. Working together, they tied the hook to the rope, and Ricky spun it once, twice, 3 times around his head while the rain lashed down and the wind howled horribly and another giant wave loomed.
Oh, I don't think you want to do this,
came Walter Bucksworth Sr.'s voice from the megaphone. Oh, I think we really do, said Ricky. You've given us no other choice. With a grunt, he let the hook fly, and it soared over the edge of the yacht. It clanged off a railing and ripped off a rope and slithered back into the sea. Everyone in the water groaned miserably, eyeing the massive waves speeding towards them like a shark. There was nothing on the ship that was easily hooked. 1 more try, Ricky shouted, and let the hook fly again. It landed on the deck and started to slide free again, unable to find purchase on the slick slip. The people in the water closed their eyes, waiting for the wave to wash them away. "Sorry for my grandfather," a voice called from the deck. They all looked and saw a young boy in a rain slicker, possibly Walter Bucksworth III. He ran down and caught the falling hook and ran back, winding it around and around the mast and cinching it tight. "All good! Climb up, quick!" Everyone began climbing, the experienced sailors going first to help hoist people over the rail. Ricky waited for everyone else, boosting those who couldn't balance on the ropes until he was the last. "Quick, Captain!" one of his crew called. "The wave! The wave!" Ricky clutched the rope and started to climb. The wave loomed above him, and the yacht rocked and rolled, and he slipped down, sea-slick hands sliding on the rough rope. For a moment, he thought he wasn't going to make it, and then his crew pulled from above, hauling him up and onto the deck like a freshly caught fish. The others dragged him inside the yacht as the wave hit. It was the biggest one yet, and the giant ship rolled and rocked and shuddered and held strong. "We made it," Ricky said. "Good thinking."
"Good teamwork."
They all hugged wetly and slapped each other on the back.
"Oh, they're dripping everywhere,"
Walter Bucksworth Sr. griped to no one in particular.
"The carpets, the carpets!"
"We were about to drown and you're concerned about your carpets?" said Ricky. "Have you no decency?" "He's rich. He can afford not to be decent," someone snorted. And the dinghy passengers cackled with laughter at that as they wrung out their wet clothes, paying no mind to the new carpet. Walter Bucksworth Sr. made himself scarce for the next hour, presumably hiding in one of the many rooms of the humongous yacht, and Ricky, the crew, and the passengers did their best to dry off and warm up. Eventually, the winds quieted. The sea went slack and still, and finally the burnished orange glow of the sunset burned away the clouds. The storm had passed.
"All right, well, the waters seem to have calmed themselves down now, so I'll need you all to make your way off the ship now, post-haste!"
Walter Bucksworth Sr. had resurfaced and affected his typical air of authority. He didn't seem at all aware that his request was absurd. "The storm has ended, but we're still all out to sea," Ricky tried to explain calmly. "Our ships are still capsized. We need you to bring us to shore."
"I understand that you need to get to shore, but I don't need to bring you anywhere. I've been quite generous enough."
"Well, actually," a passenger called, "you haven't been generous at all. We literally had to board your ship without permission to avoid getting swept out to sea."
"She's right," said Ricky, "and we'll get off the ship as soon as we've returned to dry land." "Frankly," said Walter Bucksworth Sr., "I'm not concerned about whether or not you're on dry land as long as you're not on my yacht anymore. The storm is over, a storm that I also had to weather, I might add, and now this," he gestured broadly at all the survivors on the ship, "is not my problem anymore."
"Not your problem?" Ricky had really had it with this guy, with basically the whole Bucksworth family. When you can save a life, when you could save a bunch of lives, and you decide you'd rather not just because it's inconvenient, it becomes your problem. We're all sailing this sea together, and you don't get to let us sink just because you bought the biggest boat. Maxwell Bucksworth Sr. bristled.
"I worked hard to earn this boat."
There was a silence in the room as these words rang out. "I'm sorry, who worked hard to earn you this boat?"
"Yeah, you wouldn't be able to have a giant yacht like that if we weren't doing all the grunt work to make it possible."
"That's true. We literally made this boat. I welded that hull. I stitched that sail."
"Yeah, I put in about 1,000 rivets." You...
Bucksworth sputtered, but he couldn't think of a good rebuttal. It was all true. So then, they all worked together and threw him overboard. Well, not really, but they certainly would have liked to. Instead, when they got to land, the people of the town talked, and they agreed that it wasn't fair for some people to have boats so tiny that they couldn't be safe in a storm, and for other people to have boats way huger than they could ever possibly need. Especially since they had to use the whole town to build those boats and then ignored that same town when it needed help. It just didn't make sense. So all the townspeople got together and voted. Their decision made, they took apart the yachts that had refused to save them, and all the other boats too. They stripped them down piece by piece to steel and glass and wood, and used all the materials to build new boats for everyone that were all just about the same size. Big enough to be comfortable and safe, but not so big that others were drowning in their wake. And the next time a storm came through, the town weathered it well. Together. The end. Thanks for listening.